Greetings, dear friends. Your support is our strength. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. This helps the growth of our channel. Leave comments, because feedback is very valuable to us. And now to the most relevant world news. Let's go! Zelensky demands a response from the West. Kyiv again accuses Russia of massive strikes. Secret partnership? How the US coordinated Ukrainian Armed Forces strikes on Russia. The New York Times investigation. Russia is preparing a large-scale offensive. The Ukrainian Armed Forces warn of threats in 3 directions. An elite Ukrainian regiment disgracefully fled from Guevo. Rifle units were left without support again. Hello, friends. This is Channel 8 again with your host, Sergei Ruskik. Let's talk about the main issues. Zelensky demands a response from the West. Kyiv accuses Russia of massive strikes. Volodymyr Zelensky once again appealed to Western allies, demanding an immediate response to Russia's actions. In his Telegram channel, the Ukrainian leader, the overdue leader, stated that Russian forces have struck most regions of Ukraine, and he called on the US and Europe to respond. So what does Kyiv claim? According to Zelensky, recently Russia has used as many as 310 guided munitions against Ukraine, including more than 1,000 attack drones, 9 missiles of various types, including ballistic ones. We provide our partners with all the information about the strikes carried out by the Russian army and what they are preparing for. We expect a response from America, Europe, and all allies, wrote the Ukrainian representative. Moscow's response to Ukraine. Dmitry Peskov stated that the Russian army is observing a moratorium on strikes against Ukraine's energy system. However, he warned that if Kyiv continues its vile provocations, it will not be to blame. Russia reserves the right to an adequate response. Why is this so important? Because Ukraine is pressuring the West. Zelensky is clearly counting on new arms supplies and tougher sanctions against Russia. The risk of escalation exists if Kyiv also starts attacking Russian energy. Then Moscow may resume strikes on all Ukrainian infrastructure. Western fatigue. In the US and EU, there are increasing calls to freeze the entire conflict rather than expand this aid. What should we expect next? Will Ukraine receive additional support, like the Patriot and F-16? Will Russia return to targeted strikes on Ukraine's energy facilities? Will Zelensky's pressure lead to a split in EU support? While Kyiv awaits any reaction, the war is entering a new phase where diplomacy and rhetoric mean just as much as missiles and bombs. Secret partnership. How the US coordinated Ukrainian Armed Forces strikes on Russia. Investigation by the New York Times. The secret mission of Ukrainian generals, negotiations at the US headquarters, and the creation of the Dragon Task Force. The New York Times revealed details of the covert military cooperation between Washington and Kyiv, which began back in the spring of 2022. A secret meeting was held in Germany. 2 high-ranking Ukrainian Armed Forces generals arrived in Germany under diplomatic cover for negotiations. With the command of the United States of America. The meeting with Lieutenant General Christopher Donahue marked the beginning of joint operation planning against Russia. As a result, the creation of the Dragon Group of the Secret Alliance for Intelligence Sharing, Strategy Development, and Coordination of Strikes against Russia. What did the USA allow Ukraine? The transfer of target data for missile strikes, including Crimea, although initially Washington limited attacks to new regions. Support for HIMARS strikes. The Americans controlled the launches through key cards, which they could remotely block themselves. Expansion of the presence of their advisors. Officers from the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. military began working closer to the front line. And where did Washington say no? Refusal to transfer data on high-ranking Russian officials and military personnel, avoiding direct involvement in their elimination. The Gorsk operation in the USSR was conducted without U.S. coordination. The Americans learned about it only after the fact. Why did this turn out to be so scandalous? Officially, the U.S. declared its non-involvement in planning any attacks by Ukraine. The Dragon Group effectively made Washington a co-author of the Ukrainian Armed Forces strategy, including strikes on Russian Crimea. The risk of this escalation, if Russia confirms this data, will lead to accusations of direct NATO involvement in the conflict. What to expect next? How will Moscow react? Is a new accusation against the United States of America possible? Will the role of other NATO countries in this vile provocation be revealed? Will the Dragon Group become a target for Russian special operations? The New York Times has for the first time detailed this entire shadow war of the US in Ukraine. Now the open question is whether this publication will weaken support for Guevo or, on the contrary, provoke some new arms supplies. We are waiting. Everyone is preparing for a large-scale offensive. The armed forces of Ukraine warn of a threat in 3 directions. The Ukrainian command expects a major offensive by Russian troops with the onset of warm weather. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Moscow is concentrating forces for strikes on the Sumy, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhzhia regions. At the same time, Kyiv accuses Russia of having insidious plans to disrupt the truce, although it continues to declare its readiness for negotiations, yet it continues to strike at Russia's energy system. Where is the strike expected? Sumy region. Attempts to break through into Ukraine are possible, similar to last year's operation in the Kursk region. Kharkiv region. Russian troops may resume their offensive on Ukraine's second capital. Zaporizhzhia direction. Here, likely the attacks aim to divert the reserves of the armed forces of Ukraine from Donbas. The peaceful rhetoric of Guevo in quotes. The Ukrainian authorities, who have repeatedly stated their unwillingness to agree to a truce, are now accusing Russia of plans to disrupt negotiations. What a twist. Meanwhile, Zelensky continues to demand new arms supplies from the West. His favorite word is give. In the meantime, the Ukrainian armed forces themselves are conducting active operations near the Russian border areas, while Western media, citing Ukrainian sources, present information one-sidedly, ignoring Guevo's actions. Why is this important? Because Russia is increasing its pressure. If the offensive begins, Ukraine may face a significant shortage of reserves. The West's double standards. Kyiv is allowed to attack, but when Moscow prepares a response, it is called a breach of the truce. Playing to the audience, while Zelensky talks about peace, his army is preparing for battles, and allies are supplying more and more batches of weapons. And what comes next? What awaits us next is either an offensive or some kind of information campaign. It's still unknown. How will the West react? Have they increased aid to Ukraine? Will there be a response from the Ukrainian armed forces? For example, new strikes on border regions of Russia. While Kyiv and the West accuse Moscow, the war is approaching a new round of escalation. An elite regiment of the Ukrainian Armed Forces disgracefully fled from Guevo. The rifle units were left without fire support. The 6th Regiment of Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, colloquially known as SEO, also known as the Rangers, an American name as the jerks like, left their positions in the settlement of Guevo, leaving the regular rifle unit without fire cover. This was reported by a source from the North Troop Group. So what happened? According to the source, the most elite Ukrainian unit was withdrawn from the front line in advance, despite the active offensive by Russian forces. In Guevo, only the rifle units remained, deprived of any support from this notorious special forces. This is not the first instance where the command of the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces avoids deploying elite units on the most dangerous sections of the front. And why is this so important, you might ask? Because it's the tactic of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. They preserve the elite units, sending less prepared soldiers into battle. To the slaughter, probably. The morale of this retreat, the Special Forces' withdrawal can demoralize the remaining soldiers. The consequences for the front without the support of Special Forces make holding Guevo an increasingly difficult task. What's next? Will Russia intensify its pressure in this direction? Will other Ukrainian Armed Forces units be redeployed to hold these positions? How will Kyiv react? Will they try to conceal this incident or announce that it was a planned rotational withdrawal, as they always say? For now, Ukrainian shooters are left one-on-one. With the advancing Russian troops, the command of the Ukrainian Armed Forces once again demonstrates its selective approach to using its best elite forces.